June 6, 1944. Normandy, U.S. troops, an expeditionary army that must ship every rifle, cavalry, and artillery shell more than 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, will soon call Germans the toughest fight in Europe. German forces are a defensive system that trades prepared ground, machine guns, mines, and rapid counterattacks for time and casualties, and it works until fuel and replacements run out. By early morning, the surf is cold and the smoke is low, and men are stepping into water that pulls at their packs like a hand. The horizon is a line of steel obstacles and hidden fields of fire. The first lesson arrives fast. The enemy does not need to win the beach. He only needs to make every yard expensive. It looks like a simple landing against a collapsing Reich. But it guarantees a long fight measured in hedgerows, towns, rivers, and forests, and within the first hours, you can feel the real claim. When American soldiers say toughest fight, they are not praising German magic. They are describing a machine that turns terrain and discipline into delay. Here's what most people believe. They think the Germans were simply better fighters, tougher, more fanatical, more elite. Now let's test that with the constraints and the numbers. The popular story is seductive. German infantry are portrayed as iron veterans. The SS are treated like unstoppable shock troops. German weapons are treated like wonder tools. The narrative becomes moral strength versus moral weakness, and the conclusion is simple. The Germans were the toughest because they were the toughest. But the simple story collapses when you follow the constraints. Toughness is not a personality trait. Toughness is a system outcome. Before we continue, make a prediction. Was the toughest fight created mainly by German soldiers or by German systems? Start with the first constraint. America is far away. Because U.S. troops fight across an ocean, they are forced to build a moving factory made of ships, ports, railheads, trucks, fuel dumps, medical stations, and repair depots. They didn't have the option to fight light. Every battalion is attached to a logistics tail that must survive weather submarines, damaged harbors, and broken bridges. This looks like a choice, but it's a constraint. Here's the first number that changes everything. Anchor it to Normandy in the first week when the beachhead is fragile and everything depends on getting more mass ashore. Compare a continental army that can move supplies by rail from its own cities to an expeditionary army that must float them in. Convert it into a simple consequence. 3,000 miles means weeks of travel time, and every lost ship or wrecked pier delays the next wave of ammunition and food. Punch. Distance is a weapon even when you control the sea. Second constraint. Germany is defending. Because the Germans are fighting on their own continent, they are forced to fight like a nation protecting its last industrial rooms. They don't have the option to trade space freely without losing factories, rail junctions, and fuel stocks. So they build positions designed to slow you, not to impress you, to slow you. This is where the battlefield starts behaving like a machine. A strong defense is not one wall. It is layers, mines and wire that force you into lanes, machine guns that stitch those lanes, mortars that punish your cover, artillery that hunts your assembly areas, and counterattacks that arrive not to reclaim ground forever but to keep you from organizing. Third constraint. Terrain in Western Europe favors the defender when he has time. Normandy is not a clean, open field. It is a patchwork of small farms and thick hedgerows. A hedgerow is an earth bank topped with dense vegetation that turns a countryside into a maze where visibility can collapse to a few dozen yards, and every field edge becomes a fortified line. Here's the paradox. The same terrain that looks peaceful from a map guarantees violence up close. It looks like farmland. But it guarantees ambush. Here's the next number that changes everything. Anchor it to the hedgerow fighting in the weeks after Normandy when units push field by field. Compare open desert sightlines that let armor and aircraft dominate to a landscape where you might see only 50 yards past the next bank. Convert it into a consequence. One, when you cannot see, you cannot mass fire, and when you cannot mass fire, you fight with squads at grenade range. Punch. The battlefield shrinks and casualties rise. Fourth constraint, German small unit doctrine is built for defense and counterattack. Because Germany expects to be outnumbered in material, it is forced to make every squad a decision maker. German doctrine emphasizes fire and movement centered on machine guns. The riflemen are not the main weapon. They are the security for the gun. This is where a specific object becomes a consequence. A German general-purpose machine gun is a crew-served weapon designed to produce sustained fire that pins attackers and forces them into predictable cover where mortars and artillery can finish the job. Here's what the numbers say. Anchor it to close combat in Normandy villages and later in the woods where the first burst decides who moves. Compare a rifleman firing single shots to a machine gun capable of firing more than 1,000 rounds a minute in short bursts. Convert it into human consequence. One gun team can freeze an entire platoon behind a ditch long enough for mortars to walk in. Punch. The rate of fire buys time and time kills. Fifth constraint, industrial capacity is real, but it is not magic. The United States can outproduce Germany over time. But because the German army is defending it, can spend its remaining industrial effort on the kinds of weapons that make attacking expensive right now. Mines, anti-tank guns, machine guns, artillery, and fortifications. A minefield is a cheap industrial weapon that trades metal and simple explosives for delayed movement and panic that cannot be bombed away once the infantry is in it. An anti-tank gun is concentrated industrial violence that turns a narrow road into a death funnel by forcing tanks to show their weakest angles when they maneuver. Now take the myth and replace it. The myth says German soldiers were supermen. The better model is that German defenses were engineered to convert American advantages into slow grinding fights. Why did the myth spread? Propaganda on both sides magnified elite formations. Memoirs remembered the most terrifying moments and attributed them to enemy greatness rather than enemy design. Survivorship bias elevated the units that fought the hardest sectors because those sectors created the strongest stories. And post-war popular culture loved a clean villain who was competent because it made victory feel earned. But after action reports, unit diaries, and post-war studies keep pointing back to the same truth. When U.S. troops called it the toughest, they were usually talking about situations where German systems had the highest leverage, prepared defenses, close terrain, and a commander willing to spend lives for delay. Now the domino effect. Once you break out of Normandy, you might expect the fight to get easier. You have air superiority, you have more trucks, you have more fuel, you have more artillery. You are moving fast. And then you hit the next constraint, cities. Urban combat is a geometry problem where every window is a firing position and every basement is a bunker, and every street is a channel that funnels men into intersecting fields of fire. A city fight turns tanks into infantry support because armor cannot clear rooms. Here's the next number that changes everything. Anchor it to the late summer and autumn push into fortified towns and cities in France and Germany. Compare a battlefield where you can bypass strong points to one where roads, bridges, and rail hubs force you into predictable approaches. Convert it into consequence. When you must take a city, you cannot go around it, and every day spent clearing blocks burns ammunition and men. Punch. The defender chooses the cost. Now add the constraint that most viewers underestimate. German command culture could be brutally flexible at the small unit level and brutally rigid at the political level. Because the regime is afraid of collapse, it is forced to demand ground be held beyond military logic. They didn't have the option to retreat cleanly without political punishment. This looks like courage, but it's a constraint. That produces a grim outcome. Units fight to the last because orders and fear make withdrawal impossible. This can look like superior morale. It can also be a prison. Now we escalate into the place where American soldiers most often use the language of toughest fight with a different tone. The forests. A forest battle is a visibility and artillery problem where trees hide movement and shatter shells into airbursts and turn maps into lies because a hill on paper becomes a wall of roots and mud in reality. Here's the next number that changes everything. Anchor it to the Hürtgen Forest in late 1944, where units fought for weeks in cold rain and broken ground. Compare a short breakthrough campaign to a sustained fight measured in yards. Convert it into human consequence. American casualties there rose into the tens of thousands with little strategic payoff that a civilian could see. Punch. The forest ate divisions. And that's the part people miss. The toughest fight is not always the biggest battle. Sometimes it is the battle where the system gives the defender the most advantage and gives the attacker the least ability to use his strengths. At this point, The timeline collapses into another constraint. Weather. Because air power is one of the Allied system advantages, the Germans are forced to wait for weather that grounds it. They didn't have the option to fight the Allied air umbrella head-on. This looks like timing. But it's a constraint. Now we arrive at the winter counterstroke, December 1944. The Ardennes. Cold fog and short daylight. The German plan is not to defeat America in a fair fight. It is to break the Allied system by striking where roads are few and supply lines are long and visibility is low. Here's what the numbers say. Anchor it to the opening days of the Ardennes offensive when the attack achieves surprise in places. Compare a normal day where Allied aircraft hunt movement and convoys to days when fog grounds them. Convert it into a consequence. When the sky is closed, German columns can move, and when they can move, they can force American units into rapid defensive fights without preparation. Punch. Weather can temporarily equalize an industrial imbalance, and then the constraint reasserts itself. Fuel. A mechanized offensive is a fuel consumption engine. German armor could still hit hard tactically, but a panzer force is a machine that depends on gasoline deliveries that Germany cannot reliably supply by late 1944. Here's another load-bearing number. Anchor it to late 1944 German operations when fuel scarcity is chronic. Compare an army with deep fuel reserves to an army where units sometimes train and move on rationed amounts. Convert it into a ratio. Every extra mile forward costs fuel that cannot be replaced at the same rate. Punch. Even a successful thrust can die on the roadside. Now zoom out and connect the systems. Why did U.S. troops call Germans the toughest fight in Europe when Italy also fought hard and terrain elsewhere was brutal? Because the German system combined several multipliers at once, prepared defenses that forced slow attacks, machine gun-centered tactics that punished exposure instantly, a culture of counterattack that made every gain unstable, terrain and weather that often reduced Allied firepower advantages, and political rigidity that drove units to hold and die rather than retreat. This is not admiration, it is diagnosis. Now bring in the final comparison that flips beliefs. Many people assume the Allies won because they had more stuff, so it must have been easy by the time they landed in France. The truth is the opposite. Superior logistics and industry do not remove pain. They allow you to survive it long enough to win. Here's the number that makes it hit. Anchor it to sustained operations in Western Europe after the landing when Allied forces fired enormous volumes of ammunition to keep attacking. Compare that to a defender who can often fire less, but choose where his fire matters most. Convert it into a human consequence. The attacker may need multiple shells and repeated assaults to clear positions that cost the defender a fraction in material but can still cost the attacker platoons. Punch. Advantage does not mean cheap. Now, myth bust one more oversimplification. The myth is that German toughness was purely skill and technology. The stronger model is that German toughness was often the product of defense design under constraint. Germany did have capable soldiers and deadly weapons. But the real toughest fight feeling came when American units collided with the full stack. Hidden positions, interlocking fires, mines, quick local counterattacks, and terrain that forced close combat. And when that stack met a U.S. Army that was still learning in blood, learning how to coordinate infantry tanks, engineers, artillery, and air, learning how to breach minefields under fire, learning how to fight in hedgerows without sight lines, learning how to clear towns without losing momentum. That is why the phrase shows up again and again. Not because the Germans were supernatural, because the Germans in Europe were often defending the most engineered killing ground on the continent. Now bring the system to its sober conclusion. Was it stupid? Maybe. Could it have been avoided? Here's the hard part. In a defensive war for survival, a regime can force a military to fight in ways that maximize delay even when it destroys the army in the long run. Holding ground at all costs can make you look toughest at the point of contact. It can also bleed you dry. In the end, prepared defense beat momentum for long stretches, and then industry and logistics beat prepared defense. So the real driver is not a single weapon or a single unit. It is a system sentence. In the end, geography and defensive design beat bravery, and then logistics and production beat geography. And the final question that should stay with you is the one American officers and enlisted men were forced to answer repeatedly. If the Germans felt like the toughest fight when they were already losing the war, what does that tell you about how much of combat difficulty is created by morale and how much is created by the system you walk into? If you want real history, not myths, subscribe.